Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Emily Moyer and this is Strange Mosaic, and my good friend Michael Joseph is with me this evening. And before we get started, I just wanted to remind everybody, if you are watching this on the Off Planet Media YouTube channel, please also go over and subscribe to my YouTube channel. It's Emily Moyer. All of my work will be there before it is here. All right, cool, on with the show. So this new show that I've been doing, Strange Mosaic, it's just really me with people who, some of them are friends of mine or people whose work I think is interesting. And we may talk about some of the things that they're sort of traditionally known for talking about, but I'm also just interested in them as thinkers and people and what they see is going on in the world right now and their thoughts and whatnot on it, because we're living in a very interesting time. And so, you know, Michael has usually a different take on what's going on than everybody else and is not afraid to say so, even if his opinion is unpopular. And so I always appreciate a conversation with Michael. Michael Joseph, welcome back. Nice to see you.
Always a pleasure to be here. As we were talking about, I bring my whiskey on the rocks only for your show.
Yes, for some reason, like I guess I make people want to drink cocktails. I don't know what's going on with that.
This feels like a party, you know?
Well, it is. You know, I gave up my other opportunity for this evening to sit with you, so I probably should have a cocktail too. You know what? We could be watching the first night of the Democratic National Convention.
I didn't even know what was going on. I don't pay attention.
Neither did I, but at the same time, my little thing that pops up to remind me that we're starting recording in a few minutes, I got a notice saying that the Huffington Post, Facebook for some reason thinks I care about Huffington Post, even though I've never subscribed to them or whatever, letting me know that Huffington Post was streaming the first night of the Democratic National Convention. So yeah, so that's a shit show I'm getting to avoid by, I wasn't going to watch it anyway, but by being here with you. So let's maybe just start there, dude. What's going on sort of in your neck of the woods in terms of like people's feeling about sort of this political situation? I know you recently moved from Boston to Vermont, which is a very different kind of place to live, but probably politically pretty similar to Boston. What's going on over there just in terms of their view on said virus, said racial tensions, and of course the political shit show?
Yeah, well, we have a giant Black Lives Matter road painting outside of our state house. So that kind of maybe sums it up right there on some level. But Vermont's an interesting state because it's, you know, super liberal, but they love their guns. So there's kind of a weird sort of conundrum there.
Yeah, Bernie Sanders is not anti-gun.
Yeah, I don't think you can be in Vermont, or you can only try to get like slightly lesser restrictions. I don't own a gun, but I've certainly been thinking about it after everything going on. I have an air rifle that I killed a groundhog to, you know, keep out of our new garden this year. But other than that, I don't really partake unless I'm at somebody's house and they're shooting guns. So I've shot a couple in my life, but I'm not an avid gun shooter. But anyways, back to the politics. I mean, I don't really pay much attention, but you know, I've noticed obviously when the so-called protests happen, you know, there's all kinds of brand new, you know, Black Lives Matter lawn, you know, posts or whatever they are.
Yeah.
And you know, whatever else goes with that. And in some very kind of strange areas that I never knew people cared that much. You drive through these kind of like small town rural areas, and all of a sudden there's like a little, you know, 10 house pass where like everyone's got it. And some people have like 3 or 4 of them on the same lawn. And for me, it's just like, that's just ugly in general. I don't care what the sign says. Like, why would you even do that to your lawn? I always thought that was just like, it just makes your house look hideous with like all of these different signs and stuff like that, right? You know, if people do that, you know, whatever, but that's not my choice. And so I kind of get the vibes by that kind of stuff and just observing the businesses, what they change and try to do and all that kind of stuff. So it's sort of like the slogans coming out en masse. The coffee shop now, if you drive by, has a big handwritten sign, and the first thing I can see is something about privilege. So apparently they're going to lecture you about your white privilege when you go into the coffee shop.
Yeah.
So, that's all going on. But at the same time, I also think that more underground and more like, just in private, there's probably a lot of people that really just hate that crap here too. They're just, not going to be flaunting it as much. And, I think the other part of it too is it's understandable because most people, if you get into any sort of discussion, even if you're like sort of neutral, like you're just seen as like, I was kind of joking in some of the recent stuff I've been doing. It's sort of like, if you look back to the way like lepers were treated in like the New Testament or something like that, the ancient Jewish culture. It's like now the new lepers are like anti-vaxxers or people who don't want to wear the mask or whatever. Don't touch them; they're filth. You know what I mean? And it's like the sort of like that's the modernist or liberalist kind of like heretics of the day. So it's kind of you see that and in some way, to wrap it up here, I kind of feel like I'm in the Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Totally.
The one I think there's an original, but the one I'm familiar with was like the Donald Sutherland, Jeff Goldblum one. And you just at the end, everybody looks the same, but you never know when they're going to make that shriek when you say the wrong thing. And at least I can fall asleep and be okay. But other than that, it's kind of pretty similar. So I'll leave it at that.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like you'll have this weird, I mean, I, for the most part, avoid a lot of the insanity because I'm working from home now as you are. And so I don't have to go out every day. So like, I have to go to the grocery store. So when I go out, I have to deal with that. And, on the weekends, we'll go out to eat a place that has a nice patio. And we generally try and pick places that we know where they're not too crazy. You just kind of wear your mask as you pass through the front of whatever. And then it's kind of fine after that. But occasionally, and then I go out to exercise. Like I go out and exercise in the park and there's big running trails and things like that. And I don't usually get too close to people or whatever. And some people wear masks, some don't. But every once in a while, you'll have that weird experience where somebody will like jump 6 feet away from, more than 6 feet. But if they see you coming at them without a mask, they will step aside like, you're trailing, disease like all around you and behind you, and like that there's vapors coming off in every direction and whatnot. And it's very weird, Are
you allowed to exercise for more than an hour?
Yes.
Well, I think in like Australia, they have some like crazy rules against how long you can exercise or something like that.
Well, like right now they're on like the really super extreme lockdown, like in some areas, I guess, like in like Melbourne, like there's different provinces, I guess, in Australia. Like they're like on a severe lockdown. You're not allowed to go out anywhere at all, but you can go outside to exercise for 1 hour a day. And meanwhile, apparently, like the Chinese are busy installing technology for social credit system kind of thing there, and the police department there is like praising their global partnership with China. And so some weird shit is going on there, definitely. But and I heard that in Europe too, like when Europe was on a tighter lockdown, like in the beginning, like there, that was like you can only go out for an hour a day. Here they never put any kind of time restriction on that, and they never insisted like they would there'd be like a newspaper article saying that you're supposed to wear a mask whenever you leave the house. But if you read farther down in the newspaper article, which they're counting on most people that we're not doing, it says, unless you're, going to be with people who don't live in your same house, or unless you're exercising, or unless whatever, right? So,
or unless you can't maintain 6 feet or whatever it is.
Whatever it is, right? So like, no, you don't. So the people I see out there wearing a mask while they're exercising, it's just like, people out there running in over 100-degree weather wearing a mask. I'm just like, okay. But yeah. So did you guys have like riots and looting and shit like there? Did people board up their stores or?
No, not really. Maybe in like Burlington or something. I don't know. I don't really pay attention to much of the news, but yeah, the funny thing is I think we're like one of the states that's the least affected by it. So I did go to Massachusetts recently, into Boston, and the way it works if you go into Boston is if I was from one of the infected states,
right,
I would have supposedly had to quarantine for 14 days, take a test, be approved, all this stuff, right? But there's like 3 or 4 states that are kosher, Vermont being one of them. I think Maine, maybe New Hampshire. I can't remember the other ones, but so you don't have to do any of that. You just go about your business.
Yeah.
But I think now that I'm back, I'm supposed to technically quarantine because I was in a state that, I don't know. I don't even pay attention, but I kind of hear these things peripherally. And, you know, it's one of those things where how are they really going to enforce that other than like you happen to get pulled over by a police officer and they start asking questions. But even then, like, you know, you can just say like, you know, what, oh, yep, took the test, or, you know, what, come, you know, I don't know. You can probably make up some BS to get out of it. And probably they I don't know how people have actually encountered police in dealing with this situation, but, you know, I can imagine that probably a lot of them are just sick of all this crap too, you know?
Yeah. My sister just recently, like she lives in Boston, right? And so they went to Detroit to visit her, you know, husband's mother, and they had to quarantine before they went there. And then they had to quarantine when getting back from there. And then they just went to Vermont, but they didn't have to quarantine when coming back from Vermont, right? Because of Vermont being kosher or whatnot, right?
The new kosher.
Yeah. So it is weird. There's like different rules everywhere. I don't know. I'm not even sure what the rules are. I'm not particularly fond of rules myself. So I just don't, you know, I just kind of not pay attention to them and not worry about it. I was listening to a little bit of your podcast from a few weeks ago about the COVID 1984 and about sort of this riot, you know, this sort of protest riot, this idea of the changing definitions of things like equality and truth and morality and ethics and things like that. So I have a couple, you know, obviously Vermont is not hit with this virus or a lot of this protesting, rioting kind of stuff. So you're not sort of seeing it there. I'm curious about 2 things, about what all of this, with your vast knowledge of history and control systems and things like that, I would really like to sort of hear your view on sort of like what this is in the bigger picture. And then also like, because I've been talking to people on the show a lot about like the various sort of communities or cultures we're involved in and what the response to all of this has been. Like Mark Devlin and I obviously talked about some of the response of like the dance music community to all of this kind of stuff, but you are spending a lot of time now like in the Catholic Church. And I'm curious as to what the thoughts of both the people and the, you know, higher ups in the church community you're involved in, like how they see all of this. So in whichever order you like, any of that.
Yeah, there's really 2 battling factions and then a bunch of people in the middle, as is kind of the case in a lot of instances. But right now it's like, you know, the I guess you'd call it Americanist faction, which basically is appealing to free Masonic principles first, and Catholicism taking a back seat to that. And that's kind of been the story of the church in America ever since the Carroll family. They were like the lone signers of the, you know, the Declaration, I think. And when they traveled to Canada, the Canada priests, like, I don't know if they excommunicated them or they didn't have any love for them because they were seeing them as sellouts to the Americans founding fathers because of a lot of deep-seated anti-Catholicism, not just in the founding fathers, but America in general, and especially in the 19th century. But back to the point, you have basically the Pope Francis, you know, Democratic Church of America church going on where a lot of the bishops are riding that gravy train. And then you have a resistance. There's certain popular figures. The Vigano, he's one of these people. I think it's, crap, I can't remember. It's Archbishop. And then Bishop Schneider. These are a couple different figures that are kind of like calling out things, but respectfully. and just asking for clarifications from people like Pope Francis. And, but the interesting thing is that Vigano wrote a letter, an open letter to Donald Trump, and it's pretty wild what was contained in it. It was talking about the infiltration of society and sort of like the occult hermetic axiom of, the Baphomet solvet coagula, dissolving to build up in a new way of being. And that was part of an infiltration in both the church and government that, he was trying to illuminate Donald Trump to. And, the interesting thing is Trump tweeted it out favorably, which is pretty wild, because that is like the type of Catholicism that historically in America would never be promoted, ever. That's exactly what they would want to be against. The New York Times has always been against that kind of stuff, right? The typical establishments, they would do whatever they could to not allow that to be the type of Catholicism that people would be attached to or promoting, right? The one that talks about Freemasonic infiltration and all that kind of stuff, right?
Right.
The conspiracy theory Catholics. And so it's interesting that that was tweeted out favorably. And then there's some other Catholic figures or spokespeople that are involved in that and have been very popularized by that. So it's pretty interesting that that is reaching a lot of people, that is basically alluding to things that I talk about on my channel. So it's pretty interesting times there. So that's like one element of it. But on the whole, a lot of the bishops are basically completely on board with the lockdown and basically sacrificing all these things of Catholicism. And for people who aren't involved in it, they wouldn't care about these things, but the administration of the Eucharist and how that all works, these are all things that are just being swept aside because we need to save humanity from this virus, right? And so there's like no supernatural faith involved, and it's making a clear division, and people are getting forced to kind of go left and right. And I would say it's the same in like the regular Matrix world, where people are kind of being forced into a left or right and more of a more clear divergence. And people are still in the middle, but I think that middle ground is kind of shrinking every day, at least that's my viewpoint on it. I don't know how you feel about that paradigm being applied to your world and what's going on with you.
I mean, it's hard to say here in Los Angeles because like it is so it's a blue state, and Los Angeles is certainly a blue city. I mean, there's obviously areas of Central California and Northeast California that are more red. But here it's like, although I have heard like, quiet rumblings from some people, you know what I mean? That like, they think this is bullshit, or is not good. But here it's pretty much what it feels like to me is just like people are not able to think clearly at all anymore. And I don't know if it's just related to the overall like mind control program that everyone has been exposed to since at the very least the 50s, but probably since the beginning of the printing press and before that, right? Or if it is just like an extreme Trump derangement syndrome kind of thing, like where literally, I mean, did you hear, I know you don't super follow a lot of pop culture, but I know you become aware of things through other issues and channels, but Joe Rogan was talking about how he had two friends who got coronavirus, right? And one of his friends is a guy he has on the show that he calls Fight Companion, right? This guy, Brendan Schaub, and he went to the doctor and he tested positive for coronavirus, right? And the doctor asked him, "What's your politics?" And Brendan Schaub's like, "What are you talking about? What's my politics?" He's like, "Well, hydroxychloroquine actually works, but there's a lot of people who are unwilling to take it because said he liked it." Right?
I already know what you mean by that. I'm aware of that whole controversy.
Okay, so like the guy was just like, "I don't care if it works. If you say it works and you're my doctor, I'm going to take it." So he didn't end up ever developing any symptoms. He felt fine. He didn't develop any symptoms. He was good, right? Mm-hmm. Joe Rogan's other friend, Brian Callen, I don't know what kind of conversation he had with his doctor, but he chose not to take the hydroxychloroquine, and he was sick for weeks, right? So I guess his story about why he didn't take it was he doesn't believe in taking medicine or vitamins or something like that. I don't know, whatever it is. But I mean, it is, I think we're dealing here, like, I wouldn't say it's the first politicized disease, because I'd say that maybe the first politicized, well, I mean, there was probably politicized disease in ancient times because some of the plagues were used as weapons and things like that, right? But I'd say the first, in our lives, the first politicized disease was probably HIV AIDS. And it's interesting that Fauci has his fingerprints all over that one too, right? But this is like quite literally, there are people who would rather die than take the pills that Donald Trump, right? Like, just because Donald Trump said he liked them, you know what I mean? Like it is, you know, a crazy time, and that doesn't seem to, for me, like, indicate that brain function is happening at a very high level right now. Like it's you know, I mean, the left always likes to talk about like how people vote against their self-interests, right? Like right wingers and poor people vote against their self-interests. Like I can't think of anything that is more against your self-interests than just not taking something because someone you dislike likes it, right? It's like really stupid. But like, you know, I'm someone who, I'm just gonna leave out who it is, but somebody who I love very much and who is for most of my life, I thought of as incredibly intelligent today, right? Like sent me, so I sent him a video talking about how Sweden did it better, right, than we did it, because they're now, here they are in August. They've had only one death in August, and they never did a lockdown, so they didn't destroy their economy. They didn't take freedoms away from the people. They asked them to behave intelligently and not gather in large groups and whatever, but their economy is fine. And they're down to the place where they have almost no people dying anymore, and right, and so they have almost herd immunity. So, and
you know what's really funny, just real quick, from what I can remember, whenever like people involved in that like liberal mindset, like to the extreme, they always peg Sweden as like this amazing place for socialism. But now all of a sudden, like, they're going to ignore that. Like, that's very odd. Absolutely,
right? They're going to ignore that. So I sent him a video that's talking about that, right? And he comes back at me with a Google link to the words Sweden and COVID-19, and lets me know that when I get sent to Fantasyland, he'll still FaceTime me. Right? Okay. Like I'm just crazy for thinking this, but literally, I open the page and the graph gets, so down, there's a graph about it's tracking the COVID deaths everywhere. Right. And so it has the one for Sweden. Under that, there's a bunch of articles talking about how Sweden was a disaster and they lost so many people because they didn't wear masks and all this kind of stuff. But literally up at the top, the graph literally shows exactly what I sent him the video said. And he said I was crazy. It showed that nobody had died in August in Sweden. Right. And he says, it's not zero. It's 5,770 people. I'm like, Dad, that's total. That's total for the whole time. And it's been on the decline since April, right? I said, like, no one's saying that, like, that they didn't lose people, but they're doing whatever they're doing is working, and what we're doing is not. Obviously, if wearing masks and social distancing worked, it'd be over by now. Right? Like pretty much, because most people, I'd say there's been a 90% compliance rate in, you know, most of the states that have an issue. Right. So, but like he couldn't understand, like he couldn't get it. So he literally sent me something that was proving my point, but he wasn't actually looking at the graph he sent me. He was reading the Forbes article, the CNN article, right? All saying exactly the opposite of what the graph at the top showed. Right. So it's just weird. Like there seems to be some lever that's been switched off. I don't understand in people's brains. But I don't know how else to explain it. But your point, and I hadn't thought about this, and I like this, about Sweden has always been the bastion of everything that would be perfect about socialism and blah, blah, blah. Right. You know, is now being bastardized because they just didn't go along with the flock. Right. Did you know that? So Laura today was reading a health book, right? She's a physical therapist. She was reading this book, and she found that Sweden is also the only country that went against the idea of compulsory mammograms for women, right? Because there was studies done that showed that, like, while one life might be saved, there'd be 60 more cases of cancer amongst people. Was that what it was? Something had it for every. For every one life that was saved, like a lot, 6 people died, right? So like basically just more people were getting cancer because of the mammogram, but like, it was like kind of like spending $1 billion to save $1 million or something, right? Like it was,
yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to know, like, I don't know, I just speculating here, the amount of people that go and get like chemotherapy and radiation, how many people actually recover from that versus how many times does it just end up getting worse and then they end up dying? Because I've known people personally, my own mother included, as one of those people, you know, who gets the chemo and all that stuff, and it goes away for a little bit and then it comes back way worse. And then the idea is that, well, did it fry a bunch of stuff internally that eventually it took back over? And I would just be curious, like actual legit studies on how often those things work.
I think maybe you were telling me this today, or something else I heard today said that if somebody's cancer goes into remission for even one day, they call that chemotherapy or cancer having worked, right? Never mind, if it comes back, they don't count it as a failed case. If it had remission for even one day, they count that as a success, right? So to your point, that's the answer.
Oh, okay, yeah. I mean, and that's the thing. It's like things are so incredibly subjective, and then when people are in that like extreme state of emotion and subjectivity, the goalpost shifting of their standard of judgment just shifts for whatever is convenient to try to get out of the argument or get through, you know, whatever it might be. It's more like it's a weird, like now it's like a psychological instinct. It's like, oh, if I just appeal to something that's sensitive and maybe if I attack somebody with this epithet of Nazi or whatever it might be, then that usually works. Yeah. And then so anything that they can put in the Rubik's Cube that might sort of like work in some loose connected way with that archetype, they can just say it, you know. And
so she has the exact, what was the exact thing here? It was...
Well, this is for if they're doing chemotherapy.
What was the thing with the mammogram stuff?
Here's the interpretation.
Right, so basically said that screening for breast, the study that was conducted in Sweden said that screening for breast cancer with mammography is unjustified. If the Swedish trials are to be judged to be unbiased, the data show that for every 1,000 women screened biennially throughout 12 years, one breast cancer death is avoided, whereas the total number of deaths is increased by 6. All right, so it's like, but yeah, it is interesting. And I would love to hear like Bernie Sanders' take on this, right? Because he's always talked about how wonderful Sweden and Norway and Denmark, and although those countries, all those other countries in that area of Europe did do the lockdown, and they all still have higher death rates than Sweden. So it is kind of interesting. I was looking up today, how is it possible to move to Sweden?
Yeah, and you know, I mean, that's kind of the issue of getting away from, you know, objective standards. You know, that's kind of what has been lost, and that really was kind of the a lot of what America in its early education system was formulating to kind of like give a new history that was detached from European history at the time. And it was more about promoting, you know, American patriotism and stuff like that. I think like the people like Noah Webster, Horace Mann, and then later on people like Dewey, which I believe he's from the University of Vermont, which is, you know, a place I went to for a very short stint and hated it. But nonetheless, like, I think that there's a lot of fruits that are now finally, you know, coming to fruition, right? And we're seeing, and the problem is a lot of people, and I understand this completely because I've, you know, fallen into this trap before, and I'm sure I still, you know, have my issues where my blind spots with it, but nonetheless, you know, a lot of times people want to go back to when it wasn't so bad, but it's still the same principles that they're adhering to, right? So this is kind of like that, you know, oh, go back to 1950s America and it will be great. And I'm not saying I have a problem with that, like in terms of like, yeah, that would be better, but it's still, it's just like, that's the whole point of things evolving into that based upon these same Enlightenment principles. But the other thing I wanted to mention, which is something I've been thinking about ever since this happened, I did a podcast episode on the Cathars. Now, a lot of people have a lot of sympathies with them, and there's a lot of like subjective history around them. And what I mean by that, there's a lot of people that kind of LARP on what the Cathars supposedly were about. And it's interesting the dialectics you get. Like there was actually a lot of like Nazis, especially the more occult Nazis, that thought that the Cathars' secret gnosis was like the doctrine of Aryan purity or something, right? And they were combating the Catholic Church, which at the time for the Nazis, the Catholic Church was combating all of their racial bullshit and Darwin, basically. A lot of people don't know this, and a lot of people will point to particular Catholics who were apostates and joined with the Nazi cause as being what the Catholic Church supposedly was with the Nazi. That's a whole bunch of crap. But the interesting thing is they were appealing to that because it was useful to them, pragmatic, right? Oh, there was like this group that was persecuted by the church, and they had the secret gnosis of Aryan purity, right? But on the flip side of that, you actually have Jewish liberals who are kind of like Marxists, which are the complete antithesis to a Nazi, right? That's what the Nazis were blaming the conspiracy on,
right,
was Jewish Marxist liberals. And you have one of these women who was writing how the Cathars were really liberal progressives, and that was their secret doctrine. The Catholic Church suppressed that. So which one is it? Is it Nazi Aryans that the Catholics are suppressing, or is it liberal progressives that call everything Nazis? Like that, no, none of those things make any sense at all, but yet they're inventing their own history upon what that was about. And if you actually read who the Cathars were, what they were promoting, I mean, it was pretty messed up stuff. And I'm not saying that the crusade didn't have like these bloody effects of it and, collateral damage, but nonetheless, what they were doing, they had like this whole aristocracy that had control of like castles and communities. So they had like a weird, it's very similar. This is my point. It's similar to today, where we have a lot of the people on board with this like crazy subjective liberalism, for lack of a better term. And it's among the poor and the ultra rich and the Google tech people, right? So it reminds me of the Cathars, where they had like this aristocracy bourgeoisie, but they also had all of these lower level peasants that were adhering to it. And then eventually, this is the interesting bit that I think really is really relative to what you were talking about, is once they kind of realized that they weren't going to win, they actually torched their own communities. They like burned the mother down because they didn't want to be ruled by the Catholic Church. And so that's similar to today. I'm not comparing Trump in his principles with Catholicism. There's weird overlap with like the Vigano tweet, but setting that aside, just in plain archetype, it's pretty interesting that since they had their heyday with like Obama and everything like that, now that they lost a little bit about that, they're like such spoiled babies that they just would rather destroy everything than and even go against their own health, like you said, in order to rebel. And it's really kind of tying back to a lot of Gnostic dualism that was going on in the early first centuries.
Well, remember back, and I have a question I want to ask you about the Catholic Church in just a second, but remember back when the left used to be the party of civil liberties and like social freedom and things like that, right? And the right was the one with all these rules and things people had to adhere to and do whatever. So it's so interesting how things just have been, completely flipped. Like, remember, like back in the 80s, it was sort of 70s, 80s, it was the other way around, or at least it appeared to be the other way around. What is the Catholic Church? So like my mom grew up Christian Scientist, right? And they're anti-vaccine. Like, I know there are some religions that are anti-vaccine and others don't have a position on it or not. Does the Catholic Church have a position on vaccination? I know they have a position on abortion, and they break that. There's lots of, not adhering to that going on in the Catholic Church, right? Both amongst the control system in it and in the people. But what about vaccination? I've never heard much conversation about that in terms of the Catholic Church. What is that? What is their position?
From what I understand, in like the 2000s, there was actually some, I don't know if they were encyclicals or just documents written about not taking vaccines because of aborted fetuses being attached to them. That was being said that something you shouldn't do. I think that was under Pope Benedict. I'd have to double check that. But that's kind of part of the battle now, where you have the Americanist ones who are literally saying, like, you don't have to go to Mass on Sundays. We're going to relieve you of that obligation until a vaccine is around. That's like one camp.
Right.
And then there's another camp that's vehemently against even suspending Sunday Mass at all, and also against vaccinations that in particular have anything to do with like aborted fetuses or any of that stuff that has to do with
That's
like
all of them
genetic
now.
manipulation.
That's all of them now. Yeah.
So that would be that faction that would be completely against that. So you have to deliberate between the battle, and this is similar to the parable of the wheat and the tares,
right?
Where they grow together, and then eventually at the time of judgment they're separated out, and then it kind of repeats that process throughout European history, and it's going on right now. But now we're getting a really clearer line of things being weeded out, like I said, in my opinion.
Is there any, like, from Christians, we often hear about the mark of the beast. Is there discussion of that in Catholic circles as well? Or is that like really more of a Christian phenomenon?
That's more of a Protestant phenomenon in this way. See, the end times and the Book of Revelation stuff, the Catholic viewpoint is generally speaking in certain fundamental ways very different from a lot of that typical rhetoric that you hear with the Protestant. Now, here's the issue with Protestantism. That encompasses a wide umbrella of viewpoints, similar to Gnosticism, even Judaism, right? You can say these words, and there's all these different factions within it that might fight with each other and believe completely opposite things. But they have these fundamental things where the Protestants fundamentally reject the authority of the Catholic Church. The Jews fundamentally reject Christ as the Messiah. The Masons don't reject the idea of exoteric religion, but they just view it all as pragmatism. And basically Masonry is kind of like going back to the pagan philosophers and cultures of like Greece and stuff like that. That's a lot of what the founding fathers that were deists were about. And so there's these different factions that are all kind of fighting, but they have like fundamental unifying things that they all kind of agree on, despite all of their little battles in between. So back to the point of Revelation, the Catholic perspective is that most of that stuff was fulfilled in the first few centuries AD, and that the universal kingdom was Christendom, the so-called Dark Ages, where everything was evil and bad, right? And that propaganda transcends so many different viewpoints. And there's, I'm not saying that everything was great during that time, but there's a lot of complexities to it. And I believe that there's actually a lot of the pagan cultures that was not really the most civilized barbarians, even though a lot of people want to LARP on the noble savage and say that these things were all great before Christianity. But I would actually argue that a lot of the brutality was because when you're converting a pagan culture, things take a long time to bring you out of that and get things stabilized. And so the book of Revelation from the Catholic perspective has an element of the end times and all these things, but there's certain things that are not part of that. One is like you hear about the millennium, right? Oh, it's going to be like 1,000 years. Jesus is going to come hang out with us and in Israel or whatever it is, right? That's all kind of like a Protestant phenomenon of millennialism and a future millennium. The Catholic viewpoint in the millennium is that it's a symbolic for a long period of time. Ironically, there is kind of a millennium built into it with like the 1,000 years of the Holy Roman Empire, etc. But that's kind of like an ongoing thing. So there's a lot of differences there. But back to the mark of the beast and like that kind of stuff. From the Catholic viewpoint, there is an historical mark of the beast in 666, right? You always hear 666, that number. If I can find it in a barcode or the Gematria of Barack Obama, that's the Antichrist, right?
Or if it's on your license plate, it's you.
Yeah. So there's kind of like a numerology kind of fear porn to it. And I'm not saying that like none of those things are ever, there's something of interest in them, but like a lot of times that stuff is just fear porn and it's going to scare people. But basically, if you add up the Gematria, because back in the Hebrew culture, numbers corresponding with Hebrew letters were important. And Gematria was interesting and important, but you don't make it into an idol. You don't take it to an exaggerated level of giving you insights that aren't really there, right? And so the Gematria, if you add up Caesar, Nero, and then translate it over to the Hebrew Gematria, it's 666. Now, however, this is the interesting thing. There's like a manuscript or a couple manuscripts, I think there's one in particular, that the number is 616. And so it's like, well, how do you do with that, right? Is that actually the real number? What is this? And so if you translate it from, I think it's Latin into the Hebrew, Caesar Nero equals 616. So the Catholic explanation actually explains that anomaly.
Mm-hmm.
So historically, that actually makes sense with the objective data, but there's a certain amount of inherent subjectivity in the Protestant viewpoint just by default that you can kind of interpret things as you'd like, but is there a context in history, and there's a way that the people who wrote those things, when they're alluding to something, they have something in mind, right? Like if we had, you know, a phenomenon today, like, I don't know what you would call it, just any sort of like buzz term or some sort of catchphrase that only Americans know what it means. If you took people like 1,000 years later, and you just gave them the catchphrase and told them to interpret that based upon what they know, they're going to come up with all these different things. But maybe there's a context to what we use that catchphrase for, and you have to know that context, right? And so these are all things that kind of get lost once the Protestant Reformation takes over, and that really brings about a lot of the subjective culture that has the Masonic reaction to it, and then leads us up to where we are today. So I think that there is an end times cosmology that's tied to Revelation for Catholicism, but it has certain things that are structured and you're not supposed to deviate outside of, but you can still speculate. But the Protestant version is, in my opinion, like open borders, chaos, and speculation that just leads to a giant shit show. That's my opinion.
Right. Okay. I gotcha. You were talking about Gematria for a second, and that is one of those interesting things, right? Like it is, like I was very into it for a bit, right? And you can tie a connection to almost anything, right? If you can, it's one of these things, but there is something interesting there, right? Like every once in a while, somebody will send me something and say, oh, the Gematria of this, look at the Gematria of this term, right? And it is sometimes fascinating, like the connections that come up, right? Sometimes it'll lead me in a direction when I'm going to research something, but if I don't find anything more there, then I'm not insisting that it's important, right? Because of the Gematria. But one of the things that I think is interesting about it, and particularly the way that, like, you know, it's described in some aspects of Judaism, is about like the frequency, like the vibration of that number, right? Like, or the vibration of that thing kind of bringing the thing about, right? Like that's how it's coded, as opposed to just like, you know, the way we do it is you apply a number value to a letter and all of that kind of stuff, but that isn't really in some ways what they mean in the more mystical sense of it, right? They're talking about that frequency brings that thing about or whatnot. And there is something I think that's kind of interesting about that, something sort of appealing, but yeah, you can get carried away with that, as with a lot of these kinds of things.
Yeah, and I think that it's one of those things that, you know, I think this applying the concept of idolatry, I know that's a scary word for a lot of people, but if you think about it, really a lot of it can apply to taking something that is true, but giving attributes to it that are false and exaggerating it, right? Yeah. So if, let's say, there were some vitamins that were actually decent for certain health benefits, but if you try to tell somebody that they're going to cure cancer and do all these other things, right, then you're creating a problem that's going to lead to a lot of destruction, right? And so that's kind of my viewpoint with all the number stuff. I mean, obviously in my channel, I've dealt with a lot of those things before. And, you know, to full admission, like especially in the JFK stuff, like you do go into that insanity of Gematria insanity. And I certainly understand that mindset, but I do think that there's some very strange numbers that crop up that are beyond coincidence, but then you have to explain, well, why is that? Why are they there? And then that's still a speculation in a lot of senses. But, you know, like the number 77, you see that all over the JFK assassination and the 9/11. Yeah. And then that's an important number in Crowley magic. And so that is there. Like, I don't care who you are. Like, if you understand the system of occultism on its own objective terms, that stuff is there in a way that I think is irrefutable to varying degrees. But you have to understand that system of occultism. But if you don't understand that, it's going to seem like nonsense, right? But there is a way of now, all of a sudden, if I take an article from the New York Times and I add up this word and it's 33 and that word it's 77, and then oftentimes they'll blend different types of gematria, so it's not even consistent. And then all of a sudden, all these 33s and 77 somehow equals that the Illuminati were behind this event and it's a hoax, right? So, you know, that's when it kind of gets like, maybe that's working to your detriment at that point, right? And so
yeah,
there's an element of that, you know.
Speaking of which, you mentioned JFK, and I want to go there in just a second. But speaking of which, I did interview Zachary Hubbard years ago, right? Who is kind of most well known for doing sort of some of that kind of gematria that you've talked about. Now, he's actually incredibly bright, but sometimes I think he and the people who followed him took some of that number bending and applying it to articles and all that kind of stuff a little far. But there is some truth to the fact that why is it that whenever there was an article about a certain topic, this number would seem to show up over and over and over again? Just like you're saying, why does, right, like why was it this number over and over in the JFK or in the 9/11? And my question to him, like, was, you know, because his theory was that this is the way that the higher ups are communicating with each other, and that, you know, they're kind of coding because their belief that they put it out there in front, right, all that kind of stuff. I'm like, why wouldn't it just as easily be an indication that we're living in a simulation? And he was like, his whole thing was like, he thought that was a weird idea. And I was kind of surprised. He's like, well, if we're living in a simulation, then that sucks, or we're fucked. And I thought, for somebody who is so conspiratorial in his thinking, why that idea seems to offend him, right? Like, do you, I mean, when you've looked at so many of the events and you've seen all of these numbers, right? For you, do you feel like that? Is it just as possible that we're living in some sort of computerized reality, as Philip K. Dick said, or some kind of simulation, as it is that people are encoding everything into these rituals? Could it possibly be that they're one and the same? And what is there any kind of Catholic take on the idea of a simulated reality?
I guess what I would say is I would view that stuff in a different way. I think that some aspects of those simulation ideas are kind of tied to a lot of Gnostic thinking, and that gets into like a whole nother tangent. But I would say that there are like for example, I would say like an overlap in a broad sense. There's actually a lot of things with like Neoplatonism and the idea of angelic hierarchies and how those all work. Mm-hmm. That is present in Catholicism, but the distinctions and the way that works is very different at its fundamental driving engine. So it's kind of like there's two different cars and they look pretty similar. They got the side mirror, they got the rear view mirror, they got the steering wheel, but the engines are completely different, and actually they're kind of inversions of each other. That's what I would say.
Like the difference. One is like a hybrid car and one is a total combustion engine. Right? Like,
yeah, I mean, whatever way you want to say the engine is very different, but they're kind of like an inversion. But if you look at the outside of the car and all these other things, you'd be like, oh, these are the same, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe you put one in drive and it actually goes the reverse, and the other, you know, they go opposite directions, right? Once you actually get in the take a test drive, right? So that's kind of how I would view these things. But for my opinion, and into like some of this is speculation, but it's based upon different teachings in Catholicism. And the reason I adhere to them because they make sense to me logically in this paradigm. I might not always love the way it makes sense, but it is logically consistent. And, you know, if it's true, it's true. What am I supposed to do about it? That's my opinion. So basically the way I would look at some of these things, especially with the JFK analysis and that type of stuff that I've done, there's the numbers like you talked about with like this idea of like a power in numbers. Mm-hmm. Well, in occultism, there's this idea that master numbers have like raw potential.
Right. 11, 22, 33, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's 77, whatever. Yeah. And then there's other numbers that are seen as more divine or whatever, or like there's harmonies and echoes of things, and that would get into like advanced mathematics. And you also have some of that applying into astrology. So for example, when you do aspects in astrology, that's based upon geometric relationships that have numbers. You know, the aspect that if you have a 360 degrees of a circle, you divide it by 12.
Yeah.
That's how you get your squares, your trines, your sextiles, your oppositions, and then the inconjunct aspects. And those are all divided out in 12 nice and easily. And then there's these other aspects that are kind of based upon a lot of like Johannes Kepler stuff that goes into these crazier divisions, which, you know, again, there might be like mathematics applied to that, but there also, you know, there's psychology that goes into that. So it's kind of a murky territory. But back to the point, in my opinion, and it fits in the Catholic schema, if astrological inclinations and influence is a thing, which Thomas Aquinas said that it was, but the astrology would have to be done within the restrictions of Catholic teaching on you know, not divinizing the future, right, or having a fated, denying free will, stuff like that. These would all be tied into that. So not to go into that tangent, but there would be like something about the system of creation that is inclining things in that, and cycles. Yeah. And then the numbers might go with that. That's part of creation and how God works. Now, we can never fully understand exactly how that works, but there's also the understanding that there is an angelic investation with human beings, whether it's from the adversarial fallen angel side or the obedient angels. Now, where it gets conflated in Gnosticism is that they usually take the viewpoint that spirit is only good, and as soon as something descends into matter, it's corrupted. But then matter becomes inherently evil, and that is not the Catholic position at all. And that's sort of like the whole point of the fall, that there is a corruption, but that was also a result of free will, and that goes into a whole other thing. But those are the fundamental engines that are different. There are purely spiritual beings or angels that can influence physical things. They can have a relationship with physical things, but that is not their nature. Whereas us, we are both. We are physical and spiritual. And so there are angels that rebelled, and the nature of the angelic intellect is they have full knowledge of everything that they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing. So when they make a choice to reject God, that's full knowledge and consent. So that's why they are quote unquote damned, because they know they made the choice with full knowledge that what they were doing. Whereas human beings, we see through things a lot more darkly. We screw up, we make mistakes, we burn ourselves in the stove. We can continue to keep burning ourselves in the stove and telling us it's not really burning, or, you know, we can maybe learn a lesson or two, right? So that's a lot more complex when it comes to humans, but these two forces engage with us in different ways. And so, in my opinion, a lot of what we see, I think, is sort of like angelic gang signs, if you will, for lack of a better term.
Okay. That
God is in control of all this, and he can allow things. He can allow evil and whatnot. But ultimately, nothing is going to happen outside of that allowance. So it's something that's demonic, can mess with people, and it's allowed for a higher purpose. And a lot of people will dispute that and be like, that's cruel or whatever. But whatever your personal opinion on it is, that's the paradigm. Right. And so that, to me, explains a lot of the weird stuff that's also caught up in the JFK presidency, because he's the only Catholic president ever. Mm-hmm. And he's the only one that was assassinated in such dramatic fashion for the entire world, right? I'm not, others were obviously assassinated, but that's the biggie, right? And that was also during the time where the Vatican II Council was happening, and that was seen as a great transmutation of trying to bring the Americanist Masonic ideas into the Catholic Church and having an alliance there. And that was when society was completely alchemically transmuted in the 1960s, right? And you've probably listened to all kinds of people talk about that, from Jan Irvin to whoever. So in my opinion, the JFK, there's a lot of weird Kabbalah stuff going on. I don't know how many people were actually involved and conscious of those things that were involved in Masonry or Judaism or whatever. And then how many of those people, and here's the other catch, I know I'll wrap up my point because I know I've been talking for a while, but the other issue is, and I think this is relevant to maybe the inherent subjectivity where you're saying, I'm showing this to somebody's face, the fact, but they don't see it. It's like a switch. They're not able to see it. And so the understanding of demonic oppression is that they will influence you to distort how you see reality.
Yeah.
And somebody is very interesting to listen to, whether you agree with him or not on this, is Father Chad Ripperger. He talks all about this stuff. And whether you're interested in Catholicism or not, I think it's just very interesting to listen to when you come to all this spiritual reality stuff.
For being as unreligious as I am, I can attest to what you're talking about from my background with drug use, right? Like things that I would never have thought was okay. When I was on drugs, I felt like it was okay. Maybe it didn't even feel like it was okay, but I'd convinced myself, at least for the momentary period of time while I was doing whatever I wanted to do, that it was okay. And it didn't, like, it wasn't just like, okay, you do the drug and the drug is making you do that. These drugs have a frequency that sort of bring in all sorts of other energies, entities, whatever you want to call them, demonic or archonic or whatever the fuck it is, right? Like,
there's an openness involved.
There's an openness, right? And something was coming into me that is nothing I would ever normally do, right? And it was explaining to me why what I was doing was okay. And the reason I know it wasn't me was because undoubtedly and inevitably every day, every time, like the next day or when I was done with whatever drug binge that was or whatever, I felt like I dirty and icky and terrible and I hated myself for it. And I obviously had to, at a certain point, get a grip and take responsibility for my behavior, right? But there was never a time when I was ever sober-minded where I ever thought any of those things were okay, right? No matter how long I did drugs for, I never came to think that those things were okay under sobriety, right? So it's a similar kind of thing with that kind of oppression. So, yeah.
Yeah, and with drugs and alcohol and stuff like that, there's certain things that, you know, like at least from the Catholic perspective, drinking alcohol, there's nothing wrong intrinsically with that. It's the moderation of it. So that's where you need the virtue of temperance to moderate things where things are good, but when you take them out of order, of divine order, then they become bad. That's like one version of things. And then there's some things that are just intrinsically bad, and participating in those are different. So that's actually kind of outlined in like Dante's Inferno with like the different circles. But what you were saying too about like thinking thoughts and then detaching and wondering like, are these things my own or not? But then at the same time, you're performing actions based upon those thoughts. That is similar to how it's described, where these entities can insert ideas and suggestions into your head, or especially through visualization. Mm-hmm. And depending on your choices and reacting to them, that's your free will involved, but it's almost like setting up the dominoes, but you're the one who flips it over. And, you know, it is sadistic, it is screwed up. And that you see that working in the temporal realm, right? Where kind of like the dominoes get set up with our democracy, where we get socially programmed into all these things. And then we make a choice to vote this or that, or promote this or that. But we're unaware of all these other factors. But are we also accountable? Because if we wanted to do the research on some level, we could know that this is a bunch of BS that we're falling for. So, and that gets in the idea of everybody's different. Everybody has different levels of understanding. And that's where the fundamental doctrine is, you don't also judge people in some all-encompassing sense, because you can never understand their soul, but you can deal with the objective natures and try to work out those things. And that's the best we can do. And then how people respond to that, that's entirely up to them and their free will.
Okay, you just said a bunch of interesting stuff. It's going to push over some things into the second hour that I'd want to talk to in relation to judging people and in relation to morality and things like this. But you said two things that I want to ask you a question about. So the first one was, you were talking about, this one might seem a little out there for you, but I want to hear your thoughts on it. Like you said that some things are okay, right? Like drinking alcohol is okay if it's in moderation, but there's other substances that are not okay. So I have this like pet theory that I like to play with, that the periodic table of elements actually represent quote unquote gods or spirits. And the the Bible is like one possible interpretation of it for someone who's into esoteric nutrition, as I am, is that when you put two things together in certain combinations in the body, that's a bad match. And so they're going to go to war and create all this destruction inside of your body, right? So, you know, when certain things are combined or certain things are present in your system that shouldn't be, right? Any thoughts on that from your perspective? Like, you know, we were talking about some things are okay and some things are not, right? So are there certain, you know, like chemicals that are, is there a God attached to some of these chemicals, right? Or some of these sort of elements that are, you know, should or shouldn't be in our body? Is there a spirit or a God or something like that attached to it?
Well, the understanding is that God is separate from creation. So the head honcho is outside of that. But there are these angelic hierarchies that, depending on the viewpoints, can be involved in those things. And actually, hold on, I'll just get a book real quick. It's kind of an interesting book. I talked about it a bit in something I do in my member section called the Catholic Alchemist series, where I kind of transmute a lot of things in astrology and whatever that can work with Catholicism, and it gets into all this kind of stuff. But this book is called The Angels and Their Mission. I don't know if people can read that, but it's by this Jesuit Jean Danielou. Now, the Jesuits, you have to make distinctions. The modern Jesuits are part of the problem right now, but the ones that were around for hundreds of years before probably the infiltration of the mid-20th century, they had a lot of incredible insights, and this book is one of them. So it talks a lot about the angels that are good, that are involved with the orchestration of the cosmos, the planets, the sacraments, guardian angels, spiritual life, death, and even like nations, communities, you know, all these different divisions, right? But of course, with that, you have an adversarial one that's trying to manipulate those situations, and God will allow the bad ones to be the predominant force if people aren't behaving. That's kind of their punishment. But the punishment is actually not anything other than people are getting what they ask for. If they want false things, those false things will turn around and destroy them, and you could probably argue a lot of that's going on right now. So there is an element of that you could bring in, but it might be organized in a different manner than some of
no, I mean, I think
people speculate on.
I mean, some sort of obviously there's alchemy involved with drug taking and these substances on a certain level, and so it wouldn't surprise me if there was some sort of representation, like, you know, representation of certain spirits or energies that come along with these chemicals in the body, and then the reactions that come as, you know, certain things are mixed that maybe shouldn't be mixed or whatnot, right?
Yeah, I mean, if there's an angel in charge of boron, I don't know. I can't tell you. It could be, and you could speculate on that, but like they aren't. The one thing, the difference I would make, the distinction is that all of these entities that might have dominion or a role of an authority over these things, they're not the highest authority. That's obviously,
I got you. Okay,
reserved for the Trinity, right, in Catholicism. But they do play a role, and I think that's one thing that's really lost, where a lot of the metaphysics are lost in the modernist Catholicism, and that's why like people like Father Chad Ripperger, he really gets in deep to a lot of this stuff, and it also makes common sense. It's because it ties into psychology, but it gives you the metaphysical psychology and not just like everything is a fragment of your psyche and there's no supernatural reality, that kind of thing.
Can you spell Ripperger?
Ripperger, I believe.
Okay. And then, so like, if you're going to be spiritual and religious, like the metaphysics are like the coolest, most interesting part. I'm not understanding why people would want to eliminate that part of it, because that's like the actual, like, that's the sort of really cool, interesting, mystical part. But the last thing,
the Pisces folk, they're going to naturally be inclined to be open to that stuff, and I believe that you have a predominance of that. So, you know, it is kind of funny how though our society is very preconditioned to reject all that stuff as superstition. Right. And the more people have done that, now look at what the tyranny of scientism has done to us. Yeah. Right?
So the last
sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay. The last question before we go over to the second hour then would be like, because you were talking about allowing things in like that, knocking the domino, and there was something you said in there that made me think of like what is there a Catholic kind of position or from the spiritual or metaphysical literature on this idea of the lesser of two evils, right? Like, is there lesser evils and greater evils, or is evil just evil? Like, right? Because right, that kind of thing. Like, so I'm thinking about this. Isn't Joe Biden claim that he's a Catholic?
I have no idea.
Okay, because I'm thinking like one of these conversations I get into over and over.
Oh, sorry. No, yes. I for some my head heard you say Joe Rogan. Yes, Joe Biden claims he's a Catholic.
Okay, so
sorry.
something you said in when you were just talking a few minutes ago made me think about that. Like, what would the position be on that? On like voting for someone because they are the lesser of two evils, right? That to me that doesn't seem to make good. Religious I don't know anything about religion really, but like that doesn't make good sense. But we hear a lot about that right now. I do hear a lot about that from people who aren't religious in nature, but I'm curious as to if there's some sort of position on that in the scripture, in the literature.
Yeah, there are some things I can point to, but I'm not a complete expert on it. All I know is that it's a hotly debated thing that requires a lot of nuance and distinction. So the idea is that, as far as I understand, there is an objective morality that applies to everybody universally. But based upon our own ignorance of things, our consent, our free will, our amount of intelligence, all those factors that go into making up a human being, there's a unique relationship to that where there's a balance of mercy and severity, right? So to get back to Joe Biden, the understanding is that the Catholic Church is a new Israel. It's the continuation of the true Israelite tradition of the Old Testament. There's a lot of people who say that they're of the Old Testament Israelite tradition and how they interpret that. The Jews would be one. The Protestants would be others. And then there's like, sometimes they get merged with Christian Zionism. And then there's factions within Christianity that have more commonalities like Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholicism, but they still bicker about this and that. And then there's even like the Muslims or something like that, right? So you have all these things going on. But the understanding is that the Old Testament Israelites, when they behaved badly, they got punished worse. And oftentimes their punishments would come from the pagan nations. And sometimes there's a lesser two evils of the pagan nations. There's some of them that are more righteous. Even sometimes they behave better than the Israelites. And so sometimes they were even blessed because they didn't have the direct revelation and the knowledge that, so them behaving better is actually more of a triumph in a lot of instances. So this gets back to the Old Testament paradigm where there's a separation between the Jews and the Goy, right? Or I'd say Israelites. The Jews are just one tribe out of many. But so the point of the New Testament and that time period of Christ is that this is when the Gentiles get grafted into the universal kingdom to fulfill these prophecies of Isaiah, where now the Gentiles are your neighbor, not your enemy. So this gets into the logistics of usury, right? If you charge usury, fractional reserve banking to translate, you do that against your enemies. But if you don't have an enemy anymore and everyone is supposed to be your brother and you're supposed to bring them in to the church, then that's why usury is illegal. And then there's always dispute in the Catholic perspective. But then you get all these things of like, well, what's usury in the context of 300 AD versus 1300 AD versus 2000 AD, right? So that's where you have to have these people debating what that entails. And so that's where I get to the lesser of the two evils, where this gets into the prioritizing things. What are you directly responsible for? And then what is your position in society where you live in a culture that is completely against your values and beliefs? So for example, in the Old Testament, somebody like the prophet Daniel or even Joseph, they lived in these pagan cultures. Daniel worked with Nebuchadnezzar, who was like the head honcho pagan king. So he worked in the government, But he had certain moments where he had to not comply, and they tried to kill him, but he, miracle happened, got out of it, that kind of thing. So that's the kind of understanding. It's like when you have those moments of testing, you have to try to do the right thing. But there's other moments where you have to get along, you have to have respect, you have to treat people like people, right? And so that's kind of the nature of this also. Somebody like Joe Biden, the understanding would be that if the people from the Catholic viewpoint who claim that they're part of this new Israel misbehave and completely go against the teachings, they're going to get punished way worse, and they're going to be much more of a cancer. And that's actually, it's interesting that so many of the people who are, perpetrating this lockdown are so-called Catholics. The governor of California, right? Was it Newsom? That's his name?
Newsom, Pelosi's
Biden, Cuomo.
Yeah.
And this is similar. The dialectic of this is in Nazi Germany. A lot of the Nazis, the leaders, were baptized Catholic, but everything that they were doing was against the Catholic Church's teaching. But they were trying to pragmatically use it and subjectively change it into something that it wasn't. That's the way I would view it. Yeah. And so when the people who are baptized Catholic try to do it, they have more accountability, so they get punished way worse. And look at the annals of history, right? The Nazis are now the worst archetype of a baddie ever. And, is that kind of God's results of and the ironic thing is the Nazis, everything that they wanted, they claimed that they were about, turned into the opposite, where them and the Zionist Jews worked together to get the Jews to Palestine. And then eventually the Nazi ethno-state turned into the Jewish ethno-state, the exact opposite of what they wanted. So you see these funny examples throughout history that if you plug it into that paradigm, it kind of synchronizes very well with a lot of these strange things.
Yeah, very interesting. All right, we're going to wrap up the first hour here. We're going to move over to the Patreon section where we'll talk about one of your favorite topics being JFK, and then some topics that probably aren't as much of your favorite, and that is the Trump and the QAnon phenomenon. But I think I have some nuggets, some perspectives that are a little different than you've been asked about it before, and in relation in some ways to some of this JFK stuff. And I also just want to have some conversation with you about morality and integrity, right? And sort of how the way, the importance of sort of how you align yourself to what you say you believe during this time. And actually, I think that's the best way. I don't like the word resistance, right? But all this crap that's coming down around us, really the thing to sort of stay out of that fray is imposing a certain level of morality and integrity for yourself that is, your behavior is in alignment with what you say you believe, kind of thing, right? So I want to talk a little bit about that. But before we go over into the patrons hour, two things I want to say to you, Michael. I have a lot of respect for you because you had some very hot moments with your work in the alternative media where you could have just kept pounding a certain narrative that played well and was very popular. And you probably could have been a big star. And your morality and your integrity and your interests led you a different way. Right. And so, and you made some choices. That means life is a little different for you than it might have otherwise been. But it's part of what I like so much about you and why I like talking with you, because you can't, once you know something, you can't unknow it, and you refuse to unknow it, even if it would be more advantageous to you to unknow it. And so I respect that about you. And I think people should continue to look at your work, both the work you've done in the past and the work you continue to do, even though it's changing. And, at this point, maybe it's going to become a little bit more of a backseat thing to some other things that you're doing. So please tell people where they can find your work. And I know you also do Catholic astrology, how they can have a session with you, all that kind of stuff.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. And, in retrospect, with the way things have gone since I started diverging from what was more popular, I guess, I'm in retrospect, I'm very glad that I did because, I'm a fairly observant person. I see a lot of people that I know of or even know personally, and they continued on certain trajectories that lead them to certain places that, when I observe it, I'm just like, well, personally, I'm glad I'm not there. I certainly have a lot of sympathy and understanding for why people go this way or that way. And, there's a lot of things that I still struggle with and have issue with But, you know, ultimately the things that I found foundational and most important supersede all that. So I'm willing to say, okay, I must be wrong about this or that, because these other things matter so much more in the greater context of things. And that kind of transitions into, you know, the website stuff and whatever. And yeah, it's, you know, I gave it a shot. It's more becoming more secondary, but I still do a lot of stuff with it. I still plan on doing a lot of stuff, and there's still a buttload of content on there. So if people want to check it out, they can go to www.rockstaresoterica.com. And I'm actually creating a little bit more with that, with an initiate section and an adept section. And it's not to poo-poo people's knowledge. It's more about the price difference and the amount of content. But, you know, just to keep with the esoteric theme, you know, people like that's kind of what I've done. So I might as well, you know, go with that, because it's kind of like, it's my way of like reinventing a lot of those terms and being in a secret society, like in some little, you know, niche online.
I do the same kind of stuff here.
Yeah. So they can go to that. You know, the Catholic astrology stuff, I don't really get into a lot of the astrology stuff. It's not something that I do in my regular life anymore, really. But if people are interested in it, I'm happy to do readings from that viewpoint, whether they agree with it or not. If they're just interested in hearing it and they're open to it, I can do it under that paradigm. It can be more based upon psychological stuff and the basic, you know, dealing with your family and, you know, your father and mother and your roots and growing up. And it can be more of like that more standard psychological level. And then it can get more into the crazier stuff like we were talking about with like the demonic influence tempting you based upon things in your chart and different signs or planets having more inclinations towards certain deadly sins and how you counterpart that with the virtue. So there can be like a whole nother layer to that that's more deep and like on that route, but there can also be a little bit more of a standard, you know, kind of tint to it as well.
I mean, it's kind of interesting because I received a very lengthy astrology reading from you a couple of years back, and it was really before you sort of made the transition into Catholicism. I think you were just barely starting to look into it and research it back then. But the kind of astrology you were practicing already actually aligned with later what you explained to me Catholic astrology was. It wasn't really that different. Like your astrology was much more based on explaining the life path and things that had happened and influences and things like that than it was telling me about decisions I should make about going forward. Like there was almost none of that in the session. So I think that like that was kind of true to your nature as an astrologist anyway, right? Like that was sort of more the path you were going down. So, you know, I feel like people can actually really, you know, it's a different kind of astrology than like somewhat than what like Robert Phoenix does or some other people that are great astrologers that I've had different kinds of readings from. This was more of something that explained a lot of things about myself to myself.
Yeah, it's kind of based upon your own free will in conjunction with decisions you've made leading up to the present. That's what I like to focus on, the present to the past. I can talk about like transit stuff in a broad sense, in a very limited sense with like future stuff, but it's more based upon, you know, just like, you know, another funny thing that I did in the New World Order astrology series in the end of Occult Catholicism, I was talking about how, you know, 2020 around January, we're going to have the completion of the 9/11 cycle with Pluto and Saturn in the conjunction. You know, maybe something might happen around early 2020. I don't know. Look at this. But there's no way you could ever predict what's going to happen because, in my opinion, I mean, my worldview is like God is going to do what God's going to do. And he's not bound to the system of astrological cycles. But I do think that there are patterns that are there that you can observe. And that's actually in conjunction with how you know, the Israelites viewed the cosmos and stuff like that, and then grafting in aspects of the Greek Hellenistic culture that could work with that. Yeah. And that's all part of that tradition of the Middle Ages that I think was, you know, the height of the Catholic Empire, even though it's the most demonized era of all time. But there's that element. But yeah, so I you know, people can check out the site, and they can always feel free to email me if they want to know more about what's the content.
Michael's very chatty and Michael's very chatty and very responsive. So yeah, he's always available for that stuff. All right, guys, join us at patreon.com/offplanetmedia for part 2, and we'll see you over there. All right.